1945, when Japanese female prisoners of war stepped off the transport ship onto American soil. They were certain they were about to be tortured and executed. That's what years of propaganda had promised them. Instead, what they discovered in their POW camps would shatter everything they believed about the war, their country, and why Japan could never have won. But when the most shocking moment came, the one that made hardened military women break down in disbelief, what could possibly make a prisoner realize their entire nation had been living a lie? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In the spring of 1945, Japan was losing the war, but nobody was allowed to say it out loud. Every city lived under the constant threat of American bombers. Tokyo had burned. Nagoya had burned. Osaka had burned. The fires came almost every night now, turning the sky orange and filling the air with smoke and ash. Food was so scarce that families survived on tiny bowls of rice mixed with sawdust and grass. Children had forgotten what sugar tasted like. Adults had forgotten what it felt like to have a full stomach. The government handed out ration cards, but often there was nothing left to ration. Store shelves sat empty. Factory workers fainted at their machines from hunger. Yet every morning, the radio announcers spoke in cheerful voices about Japan's certain victory. Women had become soldiers too, in their own way. When the men went to fight and die on distant islands, the women took their places. They worked in ammunition factories. They served as nurses in military hospitals. They operated radio equipment and decoded messages. They cooked meals for thousands of troops. Some were officially enlisted in the military. Others were civilian employees who wore uniforms and lived on bases. They all shared the same training, the same propaganda, the same absolute certainty about what would happen if the Americans ever captured them. The lectures were very clear. American soldiers were demons, monsters in human form. They would rape every woman they found. They would torture prisoners for entertainment. They would pull out fingernails and cut off limbs while people were still alive. Death in battle was unfortunate, but honorable. Capture was worse than death. It was eternal shame. Better to hold a grenade to your own chest than let the enemy take you alive. Keiko had been a nurse at a field hospital on Okinawa. She was 23 years old and had joined the military medical corps because her father told her it was her duty. She had watched hundreds of soldiers die from wounds, from infections, from starvation. She had learned to work without proper medicine, without clean bandages, without enough food for herself or her patients. When the Americans invaded Okinawa in April, the hospital moved into caves. They operated by candlelight. They ran out of anesthesia, then bandages, then water. The sounds of artillery shells got closer every day. One morning in June, American voices echoed through the cave. Japanese officers shouted for everyone to retreat deeper, to prepare to die with honor. But Keiko was tired. She was so tired. She had not slept more than 2 hours at a time in weeks. She had not eaten a full meal in months. When the American soldiers appeared, she simply stood there, hands raised, waiting for the bullet or the bayonet dot. It did not come. Instead, a young American soldier, who could not have been older than 20, lowered his rifle and said something in English. She did not understand the words, but his tone was not cruel. Another soldier offered her a canteen of water. Real, clean water. She stared at it, certain it must be poisoned or part of some torture. But her thirst won. She drank, and it was just water. Cold and sweet and clean. They gave her a chocolate bar. She held it in her hands, confused, waiting for the trick to reveal itself. The trick never came. Yuki had worked in communications on Saipan, translating radio intercepts and typing reports. She was captured when the base was overrun. She had tried to run but collapsed from exhaustion and hunger before she made it 100 yards. She woke up in an American medical tent with an 4 needle in her arm. A female American nurse was checking her pulse. The nurse smiled at her. Yuki had expected death or torture. She got medical care instead. Machiko had served meals in a military mess hall on Tinian. When the Americans arrived, she hid in a storage room for 2 days without food or water. When she finally emerged, delirious and weak, the American soldiers gave her soup and bread. Real bread, soft and white, the kind she had not seen since before the war started. She cried while she ate it, not from sadness but from the complete confusion of being treated like a human being by people she had been taught were monsters. The journey to America took weeks on a transport ship. The Japanese women were kept separate from male prisoners, but were given the same treatment. 3 meals a day, medical checkups, clean blankets, access to washing facilities. They whispered to each other at night, trying to make sense of it. Perhaps the Americans were fattening them up for some worse fate later. Perhaps this was psychological torture, to give them hope before crushing it. Perhaps they were being taken to America to be executed in front of crowds as revenge for Pearl Harbor. None of them could imagine the real reason, that this was simply how Americans treated prisoners of war. It was written in their rules. It was part of their law. It was just what they did. When the ship finally docked in San Francisco, Keiko stood on the deck and stared at the city. She had expected to see bomb damage, ruined buildings, signs of a nation struggling under the weight of war. Instead, she saw lights everywhere. Electric lights that blazed even in daytime. Buildings that stood tall and undamaged. Cars moving through streets that were not cratered by explosions. Cranes at the docks lifting cargo with mechanical ease. People walking around in clean clothes, looking well-fed and unhurried. She turned to Yuki, who stood beside her with the same stunned expression. How can they afford all this electricity during a war? Keiko whispered. Yuki had no answer. They had been told America was weak, nearly defeated, brought to its knees by Japan's military might. But nothing about this city looked weak or defeated or desperate. It looked like the war was happening on some other planet entirely. And America was simply going about its normal business while barely noticing the effort. The prisoner of war camp was not what any of them had imagined. It sat in the California countryside, surrounded by farmland that stretched as far as they could see. The barracks were simple wooden buildings, but they had real roofs that did not leak. Each woman received her own cot with a mattress, 2 blankets, and a pillow. There were showers with hot water that came out whenever you turned the handle. The toilets flushed. The floors were clean. Guards walked around the perimeter, but they did not carry whips or clubs. They just walked and smoked cigarettes and sometimes waved. On the first morning, a bell rang for breakfast. The women lined up nervously, expecting a small bowl of watery rice or maybe some stale bread. Instead, they walked into a dining hall that made Machiko stop in her tracks and stare. Long tables filled the room. At the front stood a serving line with metal trays and uniformed workers behind the counter. The smell hit her first. Bacon, eggs, fresh bread, coffee, real coffee, not the burnt grain substitute they had been drinking for years in Japan. She moved through the line in a daze as workers piled food onto her tray. 2 fried eggs, 3 strips of bacon, 2 slices of toast with butter, a cup of milk, an orange. She carried her tray to a table and sat down, staring at more food than she had seen on a plate in 3 years. Around her, other women were crying quietly as they ate. Keiko could not finish her breakfast. Her stomach had shrunk too much from years of hunger. She managed half the eggs and 1 piece of toast before she felt sick. But the food kept coming, meal after meal, day after day. Lunch brought sandwiches made with thick slices of ham and cheese, along with soup and crackers and canned peaches. Dinner was roasted chicken or beef stew, or pork chops with potatoes and green beans and bread and butter and sometimes pie for dessert. Pie. Actual pie with fruit and sugar and a flaky crust. At the end of each meal, workers scraped the leftover food into giant trash bins. Keiko watched them throw away more food in one day than her entire neighborhood in Tokyo had eaten in a month. She thought about her mother and her younger sisters, probably boiling tree bark to make it soft enough to chew. She thought about the patients in the cave hospital who had died because their bodies were too weak to fight infection. And here, in this prison camp in America, the guards were throwing away perfectly good food because nobody wanted seconds. The work assignments came after the first week. Some women were sent to help in the kitchen. Others did laundry or cleaned the barracks. Yuki was assigned to work in the camp garden, growing vegetables for the dining hall. On her first day, an American supervisor showed her to a large plot of land with neat rows already planted. He handed her a hoe and a rake, both in perfect condition, not rusted or broken. He showed her the irrigation system that brought water to the plants, automatically through pipes and sprinklers. Then he pointed to a storage shed filled with tools, bags of fertilizer, and boxes of seeds. More supplies in one shed than most Japanese farms had for their entire operation. Yuki worked alongside 2 other prisoners and 1 American guard who mostly sat in the shade and read a magazine. At lunch, they stopped and were brought sandwiches and cold bottles of Coca-Cola. Yuki had never tasted Coca-Cola before. The guard opened the bottle for her and smiled. She took a sip and felt the sweet, fizzy liquid fill her mouth. It was cold and bubbly and completely unnecessary, and somehow that made it even more shocking. This was a country that could afford to make drinks just for pleasure, just for fun. Even while fighting a war on 2 sides of the world, Michiko was assigned to work in the main kitchen, the industrial heart of the camp's food operation. She walked in and stopped, overwhelmed by the size of it. Massive stoves with 8 burners each. Ovens big enough to roast 6 turkeys at once. Refrigerators that hummed with electric motors, keeping rooms full of meat and milk and vegetables cold. Mixers that could blend dough for 100 loaves of bread. Dishwashers that cleaned plates automatically with hot water and soap. Everything was metal and clean and efficient. The head cook, a large American woman named Betty, showed her around and explained each machine through an interpreter. Betty treated her like a new employee, not an enemy prisoner. She showed Michiko how to operate the industrial can opener and laughed when Michiko opened a can of tomatoes and found it full to the brim with perfect, red tomatoes and thick juice. In Japan, canned goods were treasures saved for emergencies. Here, they opened dozens of cans every meal and thought nothing of it. One afternoon, a truck pulled up to the kitchen loading dock. The driver and his assistant began unloading crates, and Michiko was assigned to help carry them inside. The crates were labeled with brand names she did not recognize: Coca-Cola, Del Monte, Campbell's, Hershey's. Inside were bottles of soda, cans of soup, bars of chocolate, jars of peanut butter, boxes of crackers. Commercial products made in factories and shipped around the country and delivered to a prison camp like it was nothing special. The truck driver offered her a stick of chewing gum while they worked. She took it carefully, unsure what to do with it. He mimed chewing, so she put it in her mouth. It was sweet and minty and lasted for hours. She chewed it while she worked, this tiny luxury that some factory had made by the thousands, just so people could chew something that tasted good. The waste, the excess, the casual abundance of it all made her head spin. At night, the women gathered in their barracks and whispered to each other. Keiko wrote in a small notebook that one of the guards had given her. She wrote about the food, the machines, the electricity, the trucks, the waste. She wrote questions that scared her. If America has all this, how did we ever think we could win? If this is how they treat their enemies, what lies did our government tell us? If they can afford to give prisoners 3 meals a day and hot showers and Coca-Cola, what does that mean about everything we were taught? The turning point came on Thanksgiving Day in November 1945. The war had been over for 3 months, but the women were still waiting for ships to take them home. Japan was under American occupation now, and the process of repatriation moved slowly. Most of the women expected to spend the winter in the camp. They had grown used to the routine, the food, the strange kindness of their captors. But nothing prepared them for Thanksgiving. The dining hall had been decorated with paper turkeys and autumn leaves. Long tables were covered with white cloths. The American staff had spent 2 days preparing a feast. When the doors opened and the women filed in, they stopped and stared. The tables were covered with more food than they had ever seen in one place. Whole roasted turkeys, golden brown and glistening. Bowls of mashed potatoes with butter melting on top. Gravy in large pitchers. Stuffing with herbs and vegetables. Sweet potatoes with marshmallows. Cranberry sauce. Fresh rolls. Green bean casserole. Corn. Salads. And at the end of each table, pies. Pumpkin pies, apple pies, cherry pies. Each one perfectly baked with steam still rising from the slits in the crust. Keiko stood at the entrance with tears running down her face. She was not crying from happiness, exactly. She was crying from the complete collapse of everything she thought she understood about the world. This was a feast. This was abundance. This was a celebration. And they were including the prisoners, the enemy, the people whose country had attacked Pearl Harbor and started this whole war. An American officer stood up and spoke through an interpreter. He explained that Thanksgiving was a holiday about being grateful, about sharing food with others, about remembering that even in hard times there were things to appreciate. He said that the war was over now, and everyone needed to look forward to peace. He said they were grateful the fighting had stopped and that everyone had survived. Then he invited them to sit and eat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The meal lasted 2 hours. American guards sat at the tables with the prisoners and passed dishes back and forth. Betty, the head cook, came out from the kitchen and went from table to table, asking if people liked the food. Some of the younger guards showed the women photos of their families back home, their wives and children and parents. One guard named Tom had a brother who had been killed at Iwo Jima. He showed Yuki the photograph of his brother in uniform, a young man with a wide smile. Yuki tensed, expecting anger or blame. Instead, Tom just looked sad. He said through the interpreter that war was terrible and that he was glad it was over. He said he hoped Yuki's family was safe back in Japan. Then he served her another slice of pie. Yuki could not speak. She just nodded and felt something break inside her chest, some hard shell of certainty that had been holding her together. Michiko sat next to an American nurse named Helen who worked in the camp medical office. Helen was about 30 years old with kind eyes and blonde hair pinned back in a neat bun. Through halting English and hand gestures, Helen explained that she had grown up in California and that her best friend in high school had been Japanese American. When the war started, her friend's family had been sent to an internment camp in the desert. Helen had visited them there and been horrified by the conditions. She said it was wrong, what America had done to its own citizens just because of their ancestry. She said she was ashamed of it. Michiko struggled to understand why this woman was confessing shame to her, an enemy prisoner. But Helen seemed to need to say it, to acknowledge that America was not perfect, that it had made mistakes, that goodness and cruelty could exist in the same country at the same time. This honesty, this willingness to admit fault, was something Michiko had never heard from any Japanese authority figure. In Japan, leaders never admitted mistakes. They never apologized. They just gave orders and expected obedience and blamed others when things went wrong. After the meal, Some of the guards set up a record player and played music. A few of them started dancing. One guard asked Keiko if she wanted to learn how to dance American style. She shook her head, too overwhelmed. But she watched as other women, younger and braver, tried a few steps. Laughter filled the room. Real laughter, not the nervous kind, but the genuine kind that came from a moment of joy. Keiko looked around at the decorated hall, the full plates, the smiling faces of people who should have been enemies. She thought about everything she had been taught. Americans were demons. Americans were cruel. Americans were weak and decadent and doomed to lose. Every single thing had been a lie. Not just a small lie or an exaggeration, but a complete inversion of the truth. Japan had sent its people to die for a cause that was hopeless from the beginning. Japan had told its women to kill themselves rather than be captured by monsters. But the monsters were the only ones who had treated her with consistent human dignity. That night, Keiko wrote in her notebook by the light of the electric lamp next to her cot. She wrote about the Thanksgiving feast, and the pies and the music. She wrote about Tom showing her his dead brother's photo and still being kind. She wrote about Helen admitting her country's mistakes. Then she wrote the question that had been growing in her mind for weeks, but that she had been too afraid to form into words. What if we were the bad ones? What if our leaders were the liars and the cruel ones? What if everything we did, everything we suffered, was for nothing because we were fighting on the wrong side? She stared at the words on the page. In Japan, writing such a thing would be treason. People were arrested just for doubting victory. People disappeared for questioning the emperor. But here, in this prison camp in America, she could write whatever she wanted. Nobody checked her notebook. Nobody punished her for her thoughts. She was freer as a prisoner in America than she had ever been as a loyal citizen of Japan. The realization did not make her happy. It made her feel hollowed out, like someone had reached inside her and removed something essential. She had lost her country. Not when she was captured, but now in this moment. When she finally understood what her country really was, the repatriation ships began leaving in early 1946. Keiko, Yuki, and Michiko boarded a transport vessel in February, along with hundreds of other Japanese prisoners, both military and civilian. The American guards who escorted them to the docks shook their hands and wished them well. Some of the women had formed genuine friendships with their captors over the months. They exchanged addresses and promises to write, though everyone knew the letters would probably never arrive. Betty gave Michiko a cookbook with American recipes written in English. Helen gave Keiko a small English dictionary and a note that said, in careful handwriting, that she hoped Keiko would have a good life. Tom gave Yuki a Hershey's chocolate bar for the journey. These small gifts felt enormous. They were tokens of a kindness that had never been required, never been ordered, but had been given freely anyway. The journey across the Pacific took 2 weeks. The women were given adequate food and bunks to sleep in, but the closer they got to Japan, the quieter everyone became. They were going home, but home was not the place they had left. Letters had arrived at the camp over the months, smuggled through Red Cross channels or delivered by recently returned prisoners. The news was always bad. Tokyo was rubble. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were gone, erased by weapons that seemed impossible to comprehend. Millions were homeless. Food was scarce. The black market controlled everything. American occupation forces were everywhere, enforcing new laws and new rules. The emperor had spoken on the radio and admitted defeat, and some people said his voice sounded strange and thin, like he was just a man after all and not a living god. Everything had changed. Everything was broken. And the women on the ship were returning with knowledge that made them strangers to their own people. When the ship finally docked at Yokohama in March 1946, Keiko stood on the deck and looked at Japan for the first time in almost a year. The harbor was full of American military vessels. The docks were controlled by American soldiers who directed traffic and checked papers. Buildings along the waterfront were damaged or destroyed, their walls blackened by fire, their windows empty. Even from the ship, she could see how thin everyone looked. Workers on the docks moved slowly, their faces hollow and tired. This was victory, she thought bitterly. This was what Japan had achieved with all its sacrifice, and all its propaganda, and all its demands for absolute loyalty. A destroyed country occupied by the enemy, they had been told, was weak and nearly defeated. The processing took hours. American officials checked their documents and asked questions through interpreters. Japanese officials stood nearby, watching but not in charge. Finally, Keiko was released. She had no money and no way to get to Tokyo, so she walked. Other returnees walked with her, a long line of people trudging along roads that were cratered and broken. It took 3 days to reach Tokyo, sleeping in abandoned buildings and accepting food from strangers who had little to share. When she finally reached her neighborhood, she almost did not recognize it. The entire area had been flattened by firebombing. Her family's house was gone. In its place was a crude shelter made from scrap wood and metal sheets. Her mother sat outside, stirring a pot over a small fire. She looked up and saw Keiko and stood, her hand going to her mouth. They embraced without speaking. Her mother felt like bones covered in skin. There was no meat left on her body. Her face was deeply lined, her hair almost completely gray, though she was only 48 years old. Inside the shelter, Keiko's 2 younger sisters huddled under thin blankets. They were alive but sick with dysentery and covered in sores from malnutrition. The shelter had no floor, just bare earth. The pot contained a thin soup made from radish greens and a handful of rice. Her mother explained that this was a good day because they had rice. Most days, they ate weeds and whatever they could find in the ruins. Keiko reached into her bag, which the Americans had allowed her to keep, and pulled out the things she had brought. A can of Spam, 2 cans of peaches, a package of crackers, 3 Hershey's chocolate bars. Her family stared at the items like they were treasures from another world. Her younger sister, who was 14, picked up a chocolate bar with shaking hands and started to cry. Keiko's mother divided the food carefully, making it last, rationing it because she did not know when they would eat this well again. While they ate, Keiko tried to explain where she had been and what she had seen. She described the camp, the food, the electricity, the machines, the abundance. Her mother listened in silence. When Keiko finished, her mother said quietly that it was good she had been captured, because otherwise she would have died. At least the Americans had fed her. At least she had survived. Over the following weeks, Keiko tried to find work. The city was chaos. American occupation forces were everywhere, handing out rations, enforcing curfews, rewriting laws. General MacArthur's headquarters issued orders that transformed Japanese society almost overnight. Women could vote now. Labor unions were legal. The school system was being reformed. War criminals were being arrested and tried. The emperor had been forced to renounce his divinity and admit he was just a human being. For many Japanese, this was too much change too fast. They walked through the occupied streets in a daze, unsure of who they were supposed to be, now that everything they had believed had been proven false. But Keiko found the changes less shocking than most people. She had already experienced her moment of ideological collapse in California. She had already learned that the Americans were not demons. She had already understood that Japan had lied about everything. So when the occupation forces announced new freedoms and new rights, she simply nodded. Of course they were doing this. This was how their society worked. They had shown her in the prison camp. She found work as a translator for the occupation forces. Her English was basic, learned from the dictionary Helen had given her and from the guards at the camp, but it was enough to help with simple communications. She worked in an office that distributed food rations to displaced families. Every day, she saw the contrast that had broken her heart. American soldiers, well-fed and healthy, handing out bags of rice and flour to Japanese people who looked like walking skeletons. The same Americans who had firebombed these cities were now feeding the survivors. The same nation that had dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was now sending medicine and doctors. This paradox confused many Japanese people. They could not understand how their enemy could be both destroyer and savior. But Keiko understood. America had the resources to do both. It had the industrial capacity to wage total war and then immediately switch to humanitarian aid. It had the wealth to occupy a foreign country and rebuild it at the same time. Japan had never stood a chance. Yuki returned to what remained of her hometown near Yokohama and found her parents living in a refugee camp. They were overjoyed to see her alive. In Japanese culture, capture was supposed to mean eternal shame, but her parents did not care about shame anymore. They were just grateful she had survived. Yuki told them about the camp, about the food, about the kindness. Her father, who had been a schoolteacher before the war, listened carefully. Then he said something that surprised her. He said he had known toward the end that they were losing. He said many educated people had known, but could not say it out loud because the military police arrested anyone who spoke defeatist words. He said the propaganda had been a trap that caught everyone, and now they were all paying the price. Yuki got a job teaching English to children in the refugee camp. She used the knowledge she had gained from the guards in California. She taught her students that Americans were not demons, that English was a useful language, that the world was bigger than Japan. Some parents complained that she was corrupting the children with pro-American sentiment, but most were just grateful that someone was teaching their children anything at all. Michiko returned to her family's farm in the countryside, hoping it would be less damaged than the cities. She was right. The farm still existed, though the house had been burned and the fields were overgrown. Her father and brother had survived. They rebuilt slowly, planting rice and vegetables, selling what they could spare on the black market. Michiko showed her father the cookbook Betty had given her. He looked through it, unable to read the English but fascinated by the photographs. Cakes and roasts and casseroles and pies. Food that seemed to come from a fantasy world. Michiko tried to explain what she had seen in America, the machines and the abundance and the industrial kitchens. Her father listened and then said something she would never forget. He said that Japan had fought an agricultural war against an industrial giant. He said it was like fighting with bamboo spears against tanks. He said the leaders had known this from the beginning but had sent people to die anyway because they cared more about honor than about reality. Michiko asked why nobody had stopped them. Her father just looked tired. He said that was not how Japan worked. You did not question orders. You did not challenge authority. You obeyed until you died. That was the code, and it had destroyed them all. Years passed. Japan slowly rebuilt under American guidance. The economy began to recover. Democracy took root, awkwardly at first, but with growing stability. The women who had been prisoners in America lived quiet lives. They married, had children, worked ordinary jobs. They rarely spoke about their time in the camps because most people did not want to hear about it. The official story of the war was still being negotiated, still being shaped by politicians and historians. Former prisoners occupied an uncomfortable space in that story. They had survived when they were supposed to die. They had been treated well by the enemy when they were supposed to be tortured. Their experiences did not fit the narrative of Japanese suffering and American cruelty that many people wanted to believe. But in private, in their own families, the women told the truth. Keiko raised two daughters and made sure they understood that governments lie, that propaganda is poison, that no nation has a monopoly on goodness or evil. She taught them English and encouraged them to travel and see the world beyond Japan. She never forgot the Thanksgiving feast or the kindness of people who had no reason to be kind. Yuki taught hundreds of students over the decades, always emphasizing critical thinking and questioning authority. She kept the chocolate bar wrapper Tom had given her, pressed flat in a book like a flower. Mikiko eventually opened a small restaurant in Tokyo in the 1960s, serving both Japanese and Western food. She used recipes from Betty's cookbook, adapted for Japanese ingredients. On the wall, she hung a photo of herself as a young woman in California, standing in front of the camp kitchen. Customers sometimes asked about it, and she would tell them the short version. She had been a prisoner of war. The Americans had treated her well. It had changed how she saw the world. In 1985, 40 years after the war ended, Keiko was interviewed by a young historian researching the experiences of female prisoners of war. She was 63 years old, a grandmother, a retired translator. The historian asked her what had been the most shocking thing about her captivity. Keiko thought for a long time. Then she said it was not the food or the machines or the abundance, though all of those had shocked her. The most shocking thing was the realization that power and cruelty do not have to go together. She had been taught that the strong dominate the weak, that victors punish the defeated, that might makes right. But America had shown her something different. They had power, overwhelming industrial and military power, and they had chosen to use it with restraint. They had won the war and then fed their enemies. They had occupied Japan and then helped rebuild it. This combination of strength and mercy was something she had never imagined possible. It was the lesson that had stayed with her for 40 years. It was what she wanted people to understand. The real defeat was not military. Japan lost the war the moment it convinced its people that cruelty was strength and kindness was weakness. America won because it understood something deeper. You do not build a great nation by demanding sacrifice and obedience. You build it by creating abundance and sharing it. You build it by treating even your enemies with basic human dignity. That was the truth she had learned in a prison camp in California. That was the truth that had shattered her world and rebuilt it into something better. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.